Okay, DBQ, practice DBQ number one. And again, remember when you take the actual DBQ, it's going to be something that covers a larger period. But these are still good for you to do to practice working with documents, whether you wrote all of the stuff out or you just thought about it. So the prompt is, to what extent was the demand for no taxation without representation both the primary force motivating the American Revolution and a symbol of democracy? Now, if I had to come up with some sort of ad hoc thesis, I would say that no taxation without representation symbolized the deprivation of liberty which the colonists felt Britain was violating by the time the revolution began in 1775. However, the revolution did not result in a massive expansion of democracy, right? So I'd kind of clean that up a little bit. And that's going to make more sense as we go through it. So, look, here's what I can really help you with. All right, contextualization. What happens before that matters, okay? Knock this out of the park. The French and Indian War, which concludes in 1763 with the Peace of Paris, Treaty of Paris, ends salutary neglect, okay? Prior to this, colonists in England were so proud to be English, right? Not absolutist French, not absolutist Spanish, but rather they were British, right? And they had traditional rights of freeborn Englishmen. All of the colonies had some extent of self-government. And while Britain had the Navigation Acts, they basically weren't enforced. French and Indian War is a game changer, massive debt. Now the colonies are going to be regulated economically in order to pay off that debt. And as they're now regulated economically and taxed, this is an affront to their liberty, okay? So as we look at this resolution of the House of Burgesses in 1764, right, here they are clearly talking about that taxes passed by Parliament, by the imperial power, is not in keeping with the liberty of self-government. Now, what has happened in 1764? What was the first act of revenue? The Sugar Act, right, which was an external taxation. However, that money, however, not only was it a tax, and here you can see they are upset at an external tax, right? A tax being paid on sugar, something that is brought into port. But if you remember when we went over that, if you're busted for smuggling now, you are not tried in a local court with a local jury. You are tried by a royal appointed judge, right? So the tax itself isn't that bad. It's still an external tax, but tied into that is the idea that now if you smuggle and don't pay the tax, then you are deprived that liberty of being tried in a regular trial by jury. Now, as we talk about taxes moving on, and we look at document 2, remember the Stamp Act is the big one. Now this is the first internal tax, right? And the Stamp Act, it was something that had been in England for years, but now things are taxed internally. All documents have to pay a tax on them. And there's a real fear that if we set the precedent that an internal tax is allowed, what's to stop Britain from just keeping taxing us and taxing us and taxing us? And this is the difference between the virtual representation that Great Britain believes in, where Parliament serves all of the colonies, versus the colonists themselves that were willing to cede, as we look at the next one, right? Document 3, they are willing to cede the idea, or concede the idea that Britain has the right to tax them externally, but as far as taxing them internally, that is something that can only be done through self-government. What else do I want to talk about with that? this internal tax sets everything off. You did not see the type of resistance to the Sugar Act in document 1 that you see to the Stamp Act, right? And there's so much outside evidence, right, that we could bring in here. You know, now all of a sudden we have the Stamp Act Congress, right, that is brought in. The Sons of Liberty are organized, and the crowd activity that attacks the stamp man. Here now in document 4, right, we are talking about a tax, and again, to collect that tax, Boston had to be under military occupation, right? And you know, here's a great outside piece of evidence. You know, we could look at this in terms of the Boston Massacre in 1770, right, where you had British soldiers who were not liked stationed in Boston. They were there to make sure that taxes were collected. And without going into all the details of the massacre, you know, they were surrounded by an angry crowd. They had threats at them. They had, you know, snowballs, ice balls thrown at them, and the order to fire took place. And now it's not only are we being taxed against our will, but we're under military occupation to have that tax paid. And of course, this is the propaganda coup for the radicals, the Sons of Liberty. And we have Paul Revere's famous engraving where you did that in your summer assignment, where the Boston Massacre shows the British troops lined up, and they are now killing English subjects in Boston because the military is there to occupy the town to see that a tax is paid. You know, there's so many other things that you could bring in here, because you could also say, like, look, you've got, in addition to this Sugar Act, you've got the Proclamation of 1763, and you don't have the type of open rebellion to that. It was this taxation through non-representative government that was the most driving force to say our liberties, our traditional rights as freeborn Englishmen to self-government passing our own internal taxes, which has been threatened. You know, you could throw in here as another outside piece of evidence falling in between these two, the Boston Tea Party, right? And the Tea Act, like all the other, you know, you had you could use the outside evidence of the Townshend Acts, right? And the response to the Townshend Acts because of the writs of assistance. Again, right? There's a tax, people don't want to pay it, they're going to smuggle, and now British royal authorities have these writs of assistance, which was a blank check to search anyone, anywhere, anytime for if they suspected, you know, smuggling contraband. And you could use the Tea Act in between these two to be like, look, the Townshend duties were repealed, the Stamp Act had been repealed before, but even though tea was cheap from the British East India Company, since it was subsidized by the government, rather than pay that tax, it's thrown overboard, right? And as a result, you know, Britain drops the hammer with the coercive acts, closing down Boston, closing down the Massachusetts government, and basically declaring martial law in that area. And so once all of that stuff happens, and we have the Second Continental Congress, which, you know, still offered the olive branch petition. I mean, here you have a group that the Second Continental Congress, which here in your document, the Declaration and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Now you've got, we got to get ready to fight. Lexington and Concord have already happened, as you saw. Britain increased its military presence in Boston. And now the Second Continental Congress prepares for war, but at the same time, you can see that they also offer the olive branch petition to affirm their loyalty. As you look at this long list of grievances that are here, you know, ultimately comes back to what started this all was there was a tax, there was resistance, there was an internal tax, there was massive resistance, and now every action the British government took gave the appearance of liberty was being undermined. And you can see that in that document. You still, even though you had the king's rejection of the olive branch petition, you had a state of war going on with the colonies, you still did not see independence for 14 months after Lexington and Concord. And now you've got Thomas Paine's common sense, which now people start to think of, well, should we rebel from the monarchy? Is monarchy a degenerative institution? Is the king naturally corrupt? And so what started out as a dispute over simply taxation without consent, particularly internal taxation, and then all the mechanisms to ensure that taxes, both external, right, all the crackdown on smuggling and the violation of British liberties, if you were accused of smuggling, to the armed occupation, particularly of Boston, to prevent smuggling, to now we're not just rebelling against taxes, but we're starting to see maybe being ruled by a faraway place and ruled by England or by a king is not such a good idea. But again, and there's no like one way to write this. I'm just trying to give you guys as many ideas as possible. With all of this rhetoric of liberty, just remember the revolution stopped short of being radical. Whereas like document 6 it shows the more radical Republican element of this, of let's break away from the king. And certainly, outside piece of evidence, the Declaration of Independence is an indictment against the king. It is an argument for all of the natural law, natural rights and enlightened ideas. But if you look at document 7, like remember, it's not necessarily democracy in that the people that have a right to self-government are still white property-owning men. Slavery still exists. You see a denial of free black men voting in the North. And of course, another piece of outside evidence, we talk about women and we see no sense of democratization extended towards women. When you talk about contextualization after this, there are different ways that you can go. You can talk about, hey, the Constitution, which is sort of the capstone of the American Revolution, is sort of like a check on majoritarian democracy, and making sure that, government, as talked about the Federalist argument that a removed government from popular passions can refine and enlarge the public view. It's basically a check on short-term popular passions, which is like, in effect, democracy, right? If you want to look at it that way. You could also look at it in terms of, wow, slavery grows throughout the 19th century. And as we talked about, with whiteness becoming more and more to define citizenship as it becomes tied to race-based slavery. And as the age of Jackson, as property requirements are reduced and we have universal suffrage, i.e. white male suffrage, all of those states removed the vote from anybody that wasn't white. And when we talk about women, we talked about, women start agitating for the right to vote in 1848. It doesn't come until 1920. So you could certainly talk about it in that regard. So just sort of brainstorming some ideas with this. I hope that helped you a little bit. If you have anything that is a specific question, by all means, you can send it to me, send your template to me. But hopefully just in working through these documents, you got some experience of using them to illustrate your argument as you describe the content that's in the document. And for 3 of them, you're able to really set the context and explain the time period that, not the time period, but explain one of the 4 criteria that is involved with them. Try to give a couple of ideas for outside evidence. But as you choose outside evidence for this, again, you're trying to show, and it's not like there's one right argument, but something that talks about a motivating force for the American Revolution, something else that talks about taxation. So hopefully that helps you guys out.